The old-timers in Millinocket used to say the Penobscot River remembered everything that ever touched its waters. Every log, every boot, every body. They said it kept those memories deep in the black pools below the rapids, and sometimes, when conditions were right, it would show you what it remembered. Most of us young bucks laughed at such talk in 1922. We were there for the spring drive, for good wages, and the rush of riding timber down swollen waters. We didn't come for ghost stories. But before I tell you what we saw that April, on the West Branch, make sure you leave a like, and let me know where you're watching from. Thanks. I was 23 that spring, strong enough to work the cant hook all day, and foolish enough to think that made me invincible. I'd come up from Bangor after the war, looking for work that didn't require much thinking. Log driving suited me. You showed up when the ice broke. You moved timber downstream to the mills. You collected your pay when the last log hit the boom. Simple work for men who didn't mind getting wet and cold and sometimes dead. The West Branch operation that year was run by the Great Northern Paper Company out of a camp near Ripogenus Dam. There were 42 men in our crew, mostly Maine boys, with a handful of Canadians who came down when their own drives ended. I bunked in a wall tent with 5 others, all of us new to that stretch of river. The tent leaked where the canvas had worn thin, and on wet nights we'd wake to water dripping on our faces. But the pay was $2 a day, plus board, which was good money then. My tent mates were a mixed lot. There was Sullivan, a red-faced Irishman from Portland, who'd worked the Kennebec drives since he was 15. Next to him slept a French-Canadian named Devereaux, who spoke maybe 10 words of English, but could read water better than any man I knew. Young Tommy Hutchins had come up from Bangor with me, barely 18 and trying to prove himself to a girl back home. The Pelletier brothers, Jean and Marc, took the spots near the door. They were quiet men who'd lost a third brother to the river 2 years back. Our river boss was a Swede named Holmberg, built like a barrel with arms thick as boom logs. He'd been working rivers since the 1890s and had the scars to prove it. Bright blue eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that could carry over spring rapids. He ran a tight crew, but fair. If you did your work and didn't cause trouble, Holmberg left you alone. If you slacked or endangered other men, you'd be walking back to town before sunset. The camp itself was a rough affair, typical for logging operations. Besides our sleeping tents, there was a larger cook tent where old Sam, a grizzled veteran from Aroostook County, served up beans, salt pork, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. The Wangan tent held our supplies and tools. A small tent served as Holmberg's office and quarters. The whole camp could be struck and moved in half a day when we needed to follow the logs downstream. The drive started ordinary enough. The ice went out on April 10th, early that year, and we began breaking the landings, sending the winter's cut timber into the churning water. The Penobscot ran high and fast with snowmelt, chocolate brown and carrying enough force to snap a man's legs like matchsticks if he got careless. We worked in teams, some men on the banks with peavies and pike poles, others out on the logs themselves, keeping the timber moving, breaking up jams before they could form. The first days were exhausting but exhilarating. There's something about spring water, dangerous and cold, that makes a man feel alive. We'd start before dawn, old Sam ringing the triangle to wake us while stars still showed. coffee and biscuits in the dark, then out to the river as first light touched the forest. The logs came down in an endless stream, spinning and bumping, riding the current toward the mills 50 miles downstream. I learned quickly that river driving was as much about reading water as handling timber. Every stretch of river had its own personality. The quiet pools that looked safe could have undertows that would suck you down. The white water that looked deadly might have safe channels if you knew where to look. Devereaux taught me to watch for the subtle signs, how foam collected, which way logs spun, where the current divided around hidden rocks. The danger was constant but familiar. Every log driver knew the risks. You could slip and go under the timber. You could get caught in a jam when it broke. You could take a spinning log to the skull. The river didn't care how experienced you were. It took young and old alike. We'd already lost one man that spring, a boy from Presque Isle who'd tried to ride a log through white water and got pulled under. Found his body 3 miles downstream, pressed against a boulder, with his cork boots still on. The boy's name was Charlie Morrison, 19 years old, red hair and freckles, always grinning like he knew a joke you didn't. He'd been showing off for some of the older men, trying to prove he belonged. Took a running jump onto a big spruce log as it entered the rapids. The log rolled, as they do, and Charlie went under. By the time we got downstream, it was too late. We buried him on a hill overlooking the river, marked the grave with a pile of stones. His mother would get his final wages, and a letter from the company expressing regret. It was Devereaux who first mentioned the lantern. Third night of the drive, we were sitting around the fire outside our tent, passing a bottle of Pine Top gin someone had smuggled in. The moon was new, making the forest around us black as coal tar. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the canvas tents. We were telling stories, the way men do when they're tired and a little drunk and far from home. Sullivan was in the middle of a tale about a bar fight in Portland when Devereaux suddenly stood up, pointing downstream. He said something urgent in French, his usually calm voice tight with surprise. Jean Pelletier translated. Devereaux saw a light moving on the water, like a lantern, but wrong somehow. We all turned to look, peering into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. I saw nothing but black water and blacker forest. Sullivan said it was probably just a reflection from one of the Wangan boats, anchored downstream. But Devereaux shook his head and kept staring at the darkness, muttering prayers in French. The next morning brought fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. We worked by sound more than sight, following the roar of water and the crack of logs hitting rocks. It was dangerous work in the fog. You'd hear a log coming before you saw it, have maybe a second to jump clear. 2 men got knocked into the water that morning but managed to swim to safety. The fog didn't lift until noon, and when it did, we saw we'd moved less than a mile of timber. That afternoon, 2 of the Canadians from another crew mentioned they'd seen something strange during their night watch. A yellow light moving upriver against the current, staying low to the water. They'd called out, thinking it might be someone in trouble, but the light had vanished the moment they spoke. The men, both experienced drivers named Bouchard and Chartier, weren't the type to make up stories. They seemed genuinely puzzled by what they'd seen. Holmberg heard them talking and told them to keep their mouths shut. He said tired men saw all kinds of things that weren't there, and he didn't need the crew getting spooked over nothing. But I noticed he assigned extra men to night watch after that, and he spent more time than usual walking the banks after dark. Over the next few nights, more men began seeing it, always at night, always moving upriver. A pale yellow glow that looked like a lantern held at waist height, swaying slightly as if someone was walking. The thing that made no sense was how it moved over the water. Not in a boat, not on the logs. Moving smooth and steady like someone walking on solid ground where there was only rushing river. Tommy Hutchins saw it on our 5th night. He'd gone down to the water to fill our coffee pot and came back pale as birch bark. His hands shook so bad he spilled half the water before reaching the fire. At first he couldn't speak, just stood there trembling while we asked what was wrong. Finally, Sullivan grabbed him by the shoulders and gave him a shake. That's when Tommy told us what he'd seen. He said he'd seen a man carrying a lantern, walking on the river like it was a dirt road. The man wore old-style clothing, the kind the drivers wore back in the 1880s. Canvas pants, a red shirt, cork boots. But Tommy said the man's face was wrong. It was blue-white, like someone pulled from winter ice, and his eyes were dark holes that didn't reflect the lantern light. The figure had walked past, maybe 20 feet from shore, never turning its head, just moving steadily upstream against the current. Sullivan told him to shut his mouth before Holmberg heard. But I could see the fear working through our tent. These were not superstitious men. They were practical, hard workers who believed in what they could touch. But something about that stretch of river felt wrong. The water was too cold, even for April. The forest on both banks stayed silent, no bird calls, no small animals moving in the underbrush. Even the usual river sounds seemed muffled, like the water itself was trying to keep quiet. I started asking the older drivers about that part of the West Branch. Most didn't want to talk about it. They'd change the subject, or suddenly remember work that needed doing. But there was one man, a French-Canadian named Thibodeau, who'd worked that river for 30 years. He was 60, if he was a day, with hands gnarled from decades of holding pike poles and a permanent squint from watching sun on water. One evening, I brought Thibodeau a cup of Old Sam's coffee laced with gin. That loosened his tongue enough to talk. He told me there'd been a bad jam at Ripogenus back in 1887. A wall of logs 20 feet high and nearly a quarter-mile long. The company had been pushing the crew hard, trying to get the logs through before another storm hit. They'd been working at night, which was dangerous even in good conditions. When the jam finally broke, it went all at once. 6 men had been out on the logs, trying to find the key log that held it all together. The roar when it let go was like thunder, Thibodeau said. Logs shooting downstream, spinning and crashing, water exploding white. 5 bodies were recovered downstream, all of them crushed and broken. The 6th, a young driver named Adelard Chartier, was never found. Thibodeau said Chartier had been carrying a lantern when the jam let go, trying to find a key log in the darkness. He was just 21, engaged to a girl in Quebec City. He'd been planning to use his wages from the drive to buy a small farm, to leave the dangerous river work behind. Instead, the river took him, lantern and all. After that, men began reporting strange things on that stretch. Lights on the water at night, the sound of cork boots on logs when no one was there. A few men swore they heard someone calling for help in French, always from the middle of the river, always just before dawn. The company stopped running night crews on that section. They said it was for safety, but the old-timers knew better. On our 7th night, the weather turned vicious. Cold rain drove sideways by a north wind that cut through our wool coats like they were cotton. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Ice formed on the tent ropes, and our boots froze if we left them outside. We huddled in our leaking tent, trying to stay dry and warm. The canvas walls snapped and billowed in the wind, like they might tear loose at any moment. Around midnight, Marc Pelletier shook me awake. He pointed toward the tent flap without saying a word. Through the gap, I could see a yellow light moving past our camp, heading upriver. It moved slowly, steadily, maybe 30 feet from the bank. The rain didn't seem to touch it. The light didn't flicker or dim, despite the wind that was bending trees nearly horizontal. I woke the others. We all crowded near the tent opening, watching in silence. The light continued upstream, that same swaying motion, like someone walking. But now we could make out more details. A figure in old-style river driver's clothes, just as Tommy had described. The lantern hung from his left hand, swinging gently with each step. His feet seemed to touch the water's surface without breaking through, like he was walking on black glass. Sullivan grabbed his rifle and said he was going to see what it was. Jean Pelletier grabbed his arm and told him no. He said in French that some things were better left alone, that the dead had their own business. Sullivan shook him off but didn't go outside. We watched until the light disappeared around a bend. No one slept the rest of that night. We sat around our small stove, not talking, just listening to the rain and thinking our own thoughts. The next morning, 3 men from another crew quit, packed their gear, and started walking the tote road back to town. Holmberg was furious. He gathered us all in the cook tent and said anyone else who wanted to leave could go, but they'd forfeit their pay for the whole drive, not just the days they'd missed. No one else left, but the mood in camp grew darker. Men worked in silence. Conversations died quickly. Everyone kept glancing at the river, especially as dusk approached. That afternoon, we hit a jam at Naso-Wadnahunk Falls. Not a big one, but complicated. Logs crossed and locked in a pattern that would take careful work to break. The water pressure behind it was building. If it let go wrong, it could kill everyone working on it. Holmberg sent his best men out, including Devereaux and the Pelletier brothers. They worked for 2 hours, pulling key logs, trying to find the one holding it all together. I was on the bank with a peavey, ready to push off any logs that came too close to shore. Tommy stood next to me, nervous but trying not to show it. The jam creaked and groaned as the men worked. Water spurted through gaps between logs. The whole mass shifted slightly, then held, then shifted again. Devereaux was out in the middle, balanced on a huge pine log, when he found what he was looking for. He yelled a warning in French and English, then jammed his peavey under a crossed log and heaved. The jam shuddered, held for a heartbeat, then began to break. Men scrambled for safety as tons of timber began to move. That's when we saw him. Standing in the middle of the breaking jam was a man in old-style driver's clothes. Red shirt, canvas pants, cork boots. He held a lantern in his left hand, though it was still daylight. His face was the blue-white color of drowned flesh. His mouth moved like he was shouting, but no sound came out. He stood perfectly still as tons of timber broke around him, logs spinning and crashing through the space where he stood without touching him. Every man on that river saw him. 42 witnesses to something that couldn't exist. The figure stood there for maybe 10 seconds, mouth moving in silent shouts, lantern swaying slightly. His eyes were black holes in that pale face, and river weed hung from his shoulders like a cape. Then he turned and walked across the churning logs and white water, moving upstream against the current. He didn't slip, didn't hurry, just walked with the steady pace of a man on solid ground. He disappeared into the mist from the falls. No one moved for a long moment. Then Holmberg broke the spell by yelling at us to get back to work, to watch the logs coming down. We did, but our hearts weren't in it. That night, no one talked about what we'd seen. We ate our beans and salt pork in silence and turned in early, but I doubt any man slept well. I lay awake listening to the river, wondering what else it remembered, what else it might show us. The Pelletier brothers drew night watch. They were supposed to walk the banks, watch for jams forming, keep the logs moving. Around 2 in the morning, Jean came running back to camp, yelling for Holmberg. His brother Marc was gone. Jean was nearly incoherent, mixing French and English, tears streaming down his face. When we finally got the story from him, it chilled us worse than the April wind. Jean said they'd been walking the eastern bank when they saw the lantern again, moving upriver as always. But this time, Marc had called out to it in French, asked if it was Chartier, asked what it wanted. The light had stopped. Then it had turned and moved toward them, faster than before, gliding over the water like it was flying. Jean said Marc had stood frozen as the light approached. When it reached the bank, Jean saw the figure clearly. A young man, maybe 20, with dark hair plastered to his skull. His clothes were soaked and torn. River weed hung from his shoulders. His eyes were black holes in that blue-white face. Water dripped constantly from his clothes, but never seemed to empty. The figure had reached out toward Marc with one pale hand. Jean said his brother had stepped forward like he was in a trance, like he couldn't help himself. The figure had taken Marc's hand and led him toward the river. Jean had tried to grab his brother, but Marc had shaken him off with unusual strength, never taking his eyes off the drowned man. The two figures, Marc and the lantern carrier, had walked out onto the water together. Marc hadn't sunk. He'd walked on the surface just like the spirit. They'd moved upstream together until the darkness swallowed them. Holmberg organized a search party at first light. Every man who could be spared from the drive walked the banks, calling Marc's name. We walked both banks for 5 miles upstream, checking every eddy, every pool, every tangle of driftwood. No sign of Marc Pelletier, no footprints, no torn clothing, no body. It was like he'd never existed at all. Jean was nearly mad with grief and guilt. He kept saying he should have held on tighter, should have done something more. He blamed himself for calling out to the spirit, for acknowledging it. Devereaux and some of the other Canadians tried to comfort him, but there was nothing to say that would help. How do you comfort a man whose brother walked away with a ghost? That afternoon, Holmberg called the drive off. First time in his 20 years as river boss that he'd stopped a drive before the logs reached the mills. He said the water was running too dangerous, but we all knew the real reason. No man wanted to work that river anymore. Not with Marc Pelletier missing, and that thing walking the water every night. The logs could rot for all we cared. We spent the rest of the day building a boom to hold the logs in place until a new crew could be brought in. It was quiet work. Men who usually sang or joked while they worked stayed silent. The only sounds were axes hitting wood and chains rattling as we strung the boom. Most men planned to leave at dawn, walk the tote road back to Millinocket, and catch the train south. The company would be furious, but none of us cared. There are some wages that aren't worth earning. That last night, I couldn't sleep. The tent felt too small, the air too close. I stepped outside and walked to the river's edge. The moon was still new, the darkness complete, except for stars reflected in the black water. I stood there thinking about Marc Pelletier, about the figure we'd all seen, about the stories Thibodeau had told. The river ran quieter than usual, like it was waiting for something. The lantern appeared around 3 in the morning, moving upriver as always, that steady yellow glow, swaying with each invisible step. But this time there were 2 lights. The second one was dimmer, newer looking. As they came closer, I saw 2 figures walking side by side. The first was the drowned driver, still in his red shirt and canvas pants. The second was Marc Pelletier. Marc looked different. His skin had that same blue-white color. His clothes, which had been modern canvas and wool, now looked older, like they'd been in the water for years. River weed hung from his shoulders. He carried a newer lantern, one from our camp stores. They walked past without turning their heads, moving in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly. I wanted to call out, to say something, but my throat had closed up tight. I could only watch as they continued upstream until the darkness swallowed them. I wasn't the only one watching. When I turned back toward camp, I saw Holmberg standing by the cook tent. His face looked ancient in the starlight. He nodded at me once, then went back inside his tent. We never spoke about what we'd seen, but I knew he'd witnessed the same thing. I went back to the tent and waited for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I was the first one packed and ready to leave. Jean Pelletier asked if I'd seen anything during the night. I lied and said no. What good would the truth do? His brother was gone. Knowing he was walking the river forever wouldn't bring comfort. We left in a long line, 41 men walking the tote road through morning mist. No one talked much. Behind us, thousands of logs floated in the boom, waiting for a new crew that would come eventually. The company would find men who hadn't heard the stories yet, or who needed the money bad enough to ignore them. Holmberg walked with us. First time he'd ever left a drive unfinished. Before we'd gone a mile, he fell back to walk beside me. He asked if I'd seen anything the night before. Something in his eyes said he knew I had. I told him about the 2 lights, the 2 figures. He nodded slowly and said he'd seen them too. He told me something then that he'd never told anyone. In 1887, he'd been a young driver on his first season, working that same stretch of river. He'd known Chartier, the man who'd disappeared in the jam. They'd been friends, had planned to work the drives together for years, maybe save enough to buy their own timber operation. The night before Chartier disappeared, he'd told Holmberg that he'd had a dream about walking on water, about carrying a light forever to guide lost souls home. Holmberg had laughed at him, told him to lay off the gin. After Chartier vanished, Holmberg had seen him once, 10 years later, walking the river with his lantern. Chartier had looked exactly the same as the day he'd disappeared. Young, drowned, eternal. Holmberg had never worked that stretch of river again until this year. The company had insisted, had offered him double wages to run the drive. He'd thought 35 years was long enough for old ghosts to rest. He'd been wrong. We reached Millinocket that evening, footsore and quiet. The men scattered quickly, some to the train station, some to the bars, all trying to put distance between themselves and what we'd seen. I caught a train to Bangor that night. Never went back to the river drives again. Found work in a shipyard instead, building boats that would sail far from the Penobscot and its memories. But the story doesn't end there. Jean Pelletier wrote to me once, 6 months later. He'd gone back to the river alone, against all advice. Had to see for himself. He wrote that he'd waited 3 nights before the lanterns appeared. 2 figures walking upriver, eternal in their march. Marc had looked at him once, Jean wrote. Just a brief turn of the head, a moment of recognition. Then both figures had continued on their endless path. Jean had called out, had begged his brother to come back. But Marc had just kept walking, matching the older spirit step for step. Jean killed himself that winter, hung himself in a boarding house in Bangor. The note he left said only, "The river remembers everything." I went to his funeral. Only a handful of people came, a few men from the drive, a priest, a woman who might have been a relative. We buried him in the Catholic cemetery on a hill overlooking the Penobscot. I sometimes wonder if his spirit found its way back to the river, if he's walking with his brother now, carrying his own lantern through eternity. I heard later that Great Northern sent another crew to finish the drive. They got the logs to the mill, but 3 more men disappeared over the course of 2 weeks. After that, the company stopped running logs through that stretch entirely. Built a new road to truck the timber around it. More expensive, but safer. The old-timers said you couldn't fight the river when it decided to keep something. I kept in touch with some of the men from that drive. Tommy Hutchins became a minister down in Portland. Said what he'd seen on the river had convinced him there was more to this world than what we could understand. Sullivan drank himself to death within 2 years. Devereaux went back to Quebec and never spoke of what happened, at least not to any English-speaking man. Thibodeau worked rivers for another 5 years, but never the Penobscot. He said once that rivers had long memories, but the West Branch remembered too much. I'm an old man now, writing this in 1976. Most everyone from that drive is dead. The West Branch still flows, still carries logs when the companies run them. But they don't use river drivers anymore. All mechanical now, boom boats and machinery. Safer that way. The old skills are mostly forgotten, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes I dream about that river, about the 2 lights moving upstream through darkness. Marc Pelletier and Adelard Chartier, walking together on water that should not hold them, carrying lanterns that should not burn. In my dreams, there are more lights now. A long line of them stretching back through the darkness. All the men the river has taken over the years, all walking the same path, all carrying their lights against the dark. The Penobscot remembers everything that ever touched its waters. And now, so do I.